greetings from Jyväskylä, Central Finland. We are coming from Turo there, and I actually mentioned that I was working in cooperation with Turo about this book, and this presentation is based on some American interviews in Baltimore car seminar a couple of years ago, and also some literature review, especially from Mr. Brashu, you might know. And so this is a question about ethics of data journalism. It's amazingly that very uncommon topic in data journalism. People do not very much speak about ethics, and for instance, national press councils, they have not paid very much attention to ethical dimension in data journalism especially. And I was wondering what's the reason, and it might be that it's very difficult to find ethical problems in data journalism, because actually it's very easy to see if some information false or if you misquote someone, but in the data sets you actually have to get some kind of a connect with the data set to look at whether it's good or bad and how the analysis has been exercised. So it's not very easy to find out ethical problems, and that might be one reason that there's not very much, for instance, in Finnish press council, not very much complaints about data journalism. Data is usually referred as some kind of information. If it's incorrect, they can say, okay, it's unethical, but data as such is not very much discussed. And let me press one is point out one issue. I present some ethical problems, but my main focus is that data journalism is ethical as such. It's good. It should be done, because another way is that it's not be done. So you lose a lot of information if you're not exercising data journalism. But anyway, there are some problems, and I've constructed this kind of four-dimensional phases about ethics and its access to data, analysis of data, publishing data, and getting feedback from the public. And there are several ethical points of attention in all these phases, and they are actually following each other. So, for instance, dirty data, it's in the access, of course, if you access dirty data, but then it follows in analysis also. You have to be aware what kind of data is bad in your analysis and therefore in publishing. And of course, you have to be very open and transparent to public about whether there is bad data in the story. And same problems occur also to, for instance, interpretation. Journalists interpret data, and they have to interpret data in all those phases. So let's have a look at the first phase. So it's the access. About what do we know about access? There's one point is this limiting stories to database topics. It's very easy if you are working as a database journalist. You don't pay attention to all other sources, and you actually choose the topics based on whether the data is available or not. So, well, data you make a story. If no data, I don't pay attention to any kind of this topic, even if you are able to find information from other sources, or if you are able to find data at all, if you just satisfied what you get. And this misinterpretation data content, of course, you have to be aware what kind of conclusion I can make about this data, and what is actually missing of this data. Same is the false dirty data. Dirty data is based on data and also based on data sets. And if it's based on data, is actually question about whether it's incorrect, stored in a variant format, or it's out of date. So all these are problems. And data sets is if it's some data fields are missing, or it's stored in incorrect data fields. The same data may be stored more than once. So you have to be aware. It looks like it's okay, but certainly it doesn't have to be okay. So you have to be very much about this origin of data sets. Who is actually collecting data, and what are the motives of this collector? If it's collected for some internal use or external use or peer use maybe. So you have to know what are you doing with this kind of data. Insufficient data sets, so there are loopholes, so something is missing, and what are you doing with this data which is missing? Or whether, how much can you do with this data set at all? Storage is the same, and overdose is, I mentioned this about, it's very much a question about publishing. For instance, if you get more data that you need in a story, and it may contain confidential information of people. You are not going to use it, but you get it. And it's not okay if you get some confidential information and you're not going to use it, but you get some knowledge of it. I come back this very again. And then about this analysis. Of course, this inaccuracy is the biggest problem. If data is not accurate, it's a very big problem, and you must make certain that it's accurate. And it's because of dirty data. Answers after conclusions, you can make that. You say this means something, but you cannot justify it because analysis is not good enough. Misinterpretation results, same issue. And of course, if methods are wrong, so you actually cannot use them. You should find some better method. And after insufficient analysis, you are actually not doing everything you could do with that analysis. That's a big problem also. You should interview data, so it means that's actually like normal sources. You have to look what does it contain, what can I do with this, and what I cannot do with this. And it's very important in this phase that you got some interpretive logic about what are your conclusions. You have to know that I can make this kind of conclusions about this, and based on this analysis, and not this kind of conclusions. So data, as you mentioned before, data can lie, and it will lie if you let it lie. And this publishing may be the biggest problem. You got the whole analysis, and you are very eager to publish everything you know, or everything you found out. And there are a lot of pitfalls in this phase. I mentioned that this, as mentioned before, this negligence of using other sources is very big problem because it's a question about context to reality. If you, for instance, there's a big problem in America about this bridge inventory information. That they say that some bridges are out of date. They actually couldn't be used, and they found out that this kind of bridges in the United States are very bad. They should have not been used. And if you publish this kind of information without visiting the real places, it will be a big mistake. So it means that data is not updated. It's old data, and if you're based on the story, all based on this data only, it will make you big problems. So you have to use other sources, certainly. And this misinterpretation of importance data, you can say that this data is some kind of importance for this topic, but it certainly doesn't have to be that. So it might be relevant also. And this, of course, dirty data follows this phenomenon also. This privacy issues in the story, which is actually some kind of outcome from this overdose. There's a gun license database in America, and if you want to know who owns guns in America, you get a long database including names and addresses and all that information, what kinds of guns people have there and so forth. But there's also one variable which is that cancellation of licenses. And there's also some kind of reference. What's the reason for cancellation? That might be mental problems. So if you got the whole database, you got also know who owns the guns, who owned guns but not anymore, and what's the reason they do own any guns, and what kind of mental problems they have because they don't own guns. So there are a lot of all kind of data in one data set, and you got the overdose there. So there should be some kind of limitation for this kind of receiving data. But you know, American publishing law, it gives everything you. So they have to separate confidential information and other kind of information because it's also important for public information. you know that rich people are in your neighborhood and they don't have guns, shouldn't have guns now, but they are mentally ill. Not very good to know. And this is transparency. This is very important. We are coming back to the last phase that you have to be very transparent when you are publishing a story. So people should have some kind of right to interpret data also themselves. And at least they have to know what kind of methods are you using and what kind of conclusions you are made and what's your interpretation about this, all the results. And one way is that you publish the whole data set at the same time, so let the people do the computer runs also themselves. But it's of course another problem, of course, if you are publishing all the data, which might include confidential data. And this actually this context to reality, which I mentioned before, this in a rich inventory, that you have to have some kind of relevance to reality and you have some relations what actually these results mean in real life. It might be that if you are talking about big picture, people don't know what does it mean to individuals, but if you are doing individual stories, you have to have a big picture also that how big problem, for instance, is. And this missing visualization, which I've already been talked here, you can have a good or bad visualization if it doesn't have a very good connection to data. It might be a very appealing, but it's not the best way. So ethically it's very important that you use the best visualization options you can do. And then this last one about this feedback, which is very much neglected in a working process. So you should be asking people feedback of the results and ask them to inform about corrections they think there are in data, so editorial offices can find out whether there are something to correct or not. And I mentioned that one journalist mentioned about this, some kind of disclaimer in a story, that they just say that we have done everything we have been able to do in preparing a story, but it may contain errors because data may be not correct and we made some problems or wrong deeds in analyzing. So please let us know whether it's okay or not. And when you are enough open in this kind of process, it's okay, it's very ethical that way. So here is my presentation. I just want to add that, mention that, as I mentioned before, that data journalism is very ethical as such. I'm for it. I would encourage to do it, everyone to do it, or anyone to research it, but also it has some very big pitfalls. And I think that they are going to emerge in the future. They are not seen at the moment very clearly because data journalism is done not very much at the moment. But the more stories are proceeding, the more this kind of discussion will arise. Thank you.
Questions, comments, please?
Hi, I have a question. I was wondering how much you think that a lot of these problems come from this sort of idea of a data journalist being a separate thing. I mean, I think that data is a tool to be used alongside all the other journalistic tools, but when you have a sort of a data journalist, then there's this danger of forgetting that the data on its own isn't the story. You need context, you need to pick up the phone and talk to people.
Yeah, I think that data journalists and also they are superiors also. They demand very much stories and very hectic stories. So there are a lot of internal problems which include this kind of stories. And maybe data journalists don't have the same kind of ethical cooperation as other journalists. So they don't pay attention very much about these topics. So it's very much technologically driven problem, and the ethics will arise later.
Please.
One of the things that's identified a lot in the literature is the data journalism teams within these organisations attract people from outside of journalism, most notably people from a technological background or from an open data or more open in the web sense background. Do you think that, do you notice that there's other ethical concerns are coming in, or that there's a clash of ethics in some of those mixtures?
You're talking about open data.
I'm just talking about people who are entering into data journalism teams within newsrooms who are not journalists or don't come from a journalistic background.
Yeah, I think these kind of teams actually require some kind of journalist-based people to guide them. And it's very much issue who is actually leading the project. Is it journalist or nerds? So it's a very good way in a Wiley broadcasting company that there's a nerd, very engineer, who is only he's a journalist only asks, can this be done by this? Do you know data? Can this data, can we get the data, and what can we do with this data? And this engineer say, you cannot do this, but you can do this, and so forth. Problem is with data is that you can do almost anything with the computer, and you ask anything, you get anything answers. So you have to be very aware what you are not asking.
All right. Thanks, Heikki. And then